There is a people the history books call the Lords of the Plains, mounted warriors who seemed as old as the grasslands themselves, a nation that froze 3 empires in their tracks. The Spanish stopped pushing north because of them. The French stopped pushing west because of them. The United States waited decades before it dared develop Texas, all because of them. They looked primordial, eternal, born to the horse, masters of a homeland nobody could remember them ever not owning. So surely they had ruled those plains since time out of mind, except almost none of that is old. When you trace the language, the migration, and finally the DNA, the timeless kingdom dissolves into something stranger and far more recent, and the true ancestry runs back to a place nobody pictures. Before we go further, drop a comment, where are you watching from, and subscribe. To understand them, start with the land. For most of 2 centuries, the Comanche were the single most powerful force on the southern plains of North America, and everything about them suggested they had been there forever. Their domain had a name. The Spanish called it Comancheria, and it was not a reservation or a territory granted by anyone. It was an empire taken and held by force, stretching across what is now western and central Texas, eastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, western Oklahoma, and the southwestern corner of Kansas, a grassland kingdom larger than many nations in Europe, ruled by a people with no cities, no written laws, no standing army, and no permanent capital. And it stopped everyone. Think about what that actually means. The Spanish, who had conquered the Aztec and the Inca, who had pushed their missions and presidios across half a continent, stopped pushing north because of the Comanche. The French, expanding westward out of Louisiana, stopped because of the Comanche. And the United States, hungry for land, confident, and expanding in every direction, waited decades before it could safely develop Texas and the plain states beyond it. 3 empires, each one stalled at the edge of this grassland by a people on horseback. That is not a footnote. That is one of the most remarkable facts in the entire history of the continent. At their height, their numbers ran somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 people. As horsemen, they had no equals anywhere in the Americas. Children learned to ride almost before they could walk. Men and women alike developed a command of the horse that European observers described with a kind of disbelief, watching riders hang off the side of a galloping animal and loose arrows from underneath its neck. Their entire world turned on 2 creatures. The buffalo gave them food, clothing, and shelter. The horse gave them speed, reach, wealth, and war. Together they built a way of life so complete, so perfectly fitted to the open plains, that it looked like the product of 1,000 years of slow refinement. And that is exactly the impression that has come down to us. The Comanche of legend are primordial, eternal, a people seemingly carved out of the grassland itself, as ancient and immovable as the land they ruled. When most of us picture them, we picture something timeless, a nation that surely had owned those plains since long before any European set foot on them, riding the same herds across the same horizon for countless generations beyond memory. It is one of the most convincing pictures in American history. It is also almost entirely wrong. Because when you actually go looking for the Comanche in the deep record, when you trace the language they spoke, the route their ancestors walked, and the evidence buried in their DNA, you run into something that should not be possible for a people this powerful and this established. They are barely there. The empire is real. The horsemanship is real. The wall against 3 nations is real. But the roots that should run back thousands of years simply are not. So here's the question that breaks the whole legend open. If the Comanche were the oldest power on the plains, why does every piece of hard evidence say they arrived almost yesterday? To answer that, you have to start with the land, and not the land you are picturing. Forget the open grassland for a moment. The story of the Comanche does not begin on the plains at all. It begins hundreds of miles to the west and north, in the Great Basin, a vast bowl of high desert, covering most of present-day Nevada and reaching into Utah, Idaho, Oregon, and California. This is sagebrush country, dry, cold in winter, brutally hot in summer, thin on water and thin on game, one of the harshest environments on the continent for human beings to survive in. And this, not the Buffalo Plains, is the homeland. Because the Comanche were Shoshone. Before they were the lords of the plains, before the horse, before Comancheria, they were a Shoshone people of the Great Basin, hunter-gatherers scratching a living from one of the most demanding landscapes in North America. They spoke a Numic language, part of the wider Uto-Aztecan family, the same broad linguistic world that connects them to the Ute, the Paiute, and far to the south, the Aztec. Their closest living relatives are the Eastern Shoshone of Wyoming, a people who have been in that region making the same kinds of tools for as long as 3,000 years. That is the deep continuity. And the Comanche broke away from it. Here is where the timeline stops making sense for a supposedly ancient nation. The split happened in the very late 1600s or the very early 1700s. Bands of Eastern Shoshone separated from the main body of their people and began moving southeast, down out of the mountains and onto the northern edge of the plains. Over the following generations, the dialect they carried with them slowly drifted. Sounds shifted, words changed. And what had been a form of Shoshone became, by the early 20th century, a separate language entirely. The two tongues are still close enough that the kinship is obvious, but they are no longer the same. A whole new people, with a new language, emerged inside the span of a few centuries. Even the name carries the clue. The word Comanche is not their word at all. It comes from a Ute term, and the most common translation is something like enemy, or more vividly, anyone who wants to fight me all the time. It was a label applied from the outside by other people, describing what these newcomers were to them. The Comanche did not call themselves that. They called themselves Numunu, which means simply the people. The name the world knows them by was given by their rivals. The name they gave themselves was the oldest claim a human group can make. So, sit with what this actually means. The nation that stopped 3 empires, the people who looked as eternal as the grassland itself, did not exist as a distinct people much before the United States did. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Comanche had been a separate nation for only a handful of generations. They were younger than the printing press in English-speaking America, younger in a real sense than the colonies themselves. The empire was new, astonishingly new. Which leaves the hardest question of all still standing. How does a people go from desert foragers to the masters of the plains in less than 100 years? The answer is a single animal, not a slow accumulation of culture over centuries, not a gradual mastery of the grassland passed down through countless generations. One creature, arriving at one moment, changed everything. The horse. Horses were not native to the Americas in any form the Comanche had ever known. They came with the Spanish, spreading north through trade, through raids, through animals that escaped and bred wild across the open country. And sometime in the late 1600s, the Shoshone bands drifting onto the plains got hold of them. What happened next is one of the fastest cultural transformations recorded anywhere in human history. A people on foot, hauling their lives across the desert at walking pace, became a mounted nation almost overnight. Mobility that had been measured in miles a day became miles in an hour, and the entire shape of their existence reorganized itself around the animal. Consider what the horse actually unlocked. On foot, hunting buffalo was slow, dangerous, and uncertain. On horseback, a rider could run down the herds, follow them across the seasons, and take what he needed almost at will. Food became abundant. On foot, a raid meant a long march and a longer retreat. On horseback, the Comanche could strike a settlement hundreds of miles away and be gone before anyone organized a response. War became something they could project across enormous distances, and the horse itself became wealth. A man's standing, a family's prosperity, the measure of power within the bands, all of it came to be counted in horses. The animal was food servant, war's weapon, and money all at once. So they moved south to where the conditions were perfect, down out of the colder country into the warmer southern plains, where the grass-fed enormous herds of buffalo and wild mustangs ran in the thousands, free for the taking by anyone skilled enough to catch and break them. Along the way, they traded with the French for guns and ammunition, and with the Wichita on the Red River for what they needed. There was pressure behind them too, from better armed peoples to the north and east, the Blackfoot and the Crow, pushing them onward. Everything funneled them toward the one landscape where a horse nation could become unstoppable. And there, on the southern plains, they did. Now hold the whole picture in your mind, because this is the part that should genuinely stop you. The Comanche did not slowly evolve into the lords of the plains across some unbroken stretch of deep time. There was no 1,000-year apprenticeship on the grassland. A people of desert foragers acquired one animal and inside roughly a single century turned themselves into the most formidable light cavalry on the continent and the masters of an empire larger than many countries. The horse did not enhance an ancient Comanche culture. The horse created the Comanche culture we recognize. Strip the animal away, and you do not find an older version of the same nation underneath. You find Shoshone hunter-gatherers in the desert. The empire was not the product of age. It was the product of speed. Which raises the deeper question, the one the legend never thinks to ask. If the Comanche as a plains people are this young, this recently made, then where does the blood itself actually lead? For that, you have to turn to the DNA. To follow the blood, you first have to understand the tools, because researchers do not read Ancestry as a single thing. They read it along separate lines. There is mitochondrial DNA, passed from a mother to all her children, tracing a direct maternal line back through time, without ever mixing with the father's contribution. There is the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, tracing a paternal line the same way. And there is autosomal DNA, the broad blend inherited from every ancestral line at once, which captures more of the whole picture but grows diluted with each passing generation, becoming less precise the further back you reach. Each tool tells a different part of the story. Together, they let geneticists reconstruct where a people actually came from. For the Comanche, those tools point in one clear direction first, and it confirms everything the language already told us. The genetic and linguistic evidence binds them tightly to the Shoshone and to the wider family of Numic-speaking peoples of the Great Basin. This is not guesswork. Linguists studying the Numic languages found a striking pattern, a small core homeland from which the languages appear to have spread outward quite recently, with reconstructions pointing to the southern Sierra Nevada and a proto-Numic homeland roughly 2,000 years ago. A mitochondrial DNA study published in 2001 supported that very picture, the maternal lines tracing the same recent expansion the language implied. The desert origin, the Shoshone kinship, the recent split, all of it lines up. The Comanche are exactly who the linguistic trail said they were, but here the story demands a piece of honesty, the kind that separates real evidence from comfortable storytelling. There is no large, Comanche-specific ancient genome study sitting in a journal somewhere, no single landmark paper that sequenced the founding families the way it has been done for some other populations. And the reason matters. Native nations in the United States have often, and entirely understandably, declined to hand their DNA to outside researchers. After centuries of being studied, classified, and dispossessed, many regard their own genetics as a matter of sovereignty, something that belongs to the people and is not the property of any laboratory. That is a decision to be respected, not worked around. So the picture we can draw is assembled carefully from their close relatives, from the Shoshone and the broader Numic world, and from the wider record of Native American ancestry across the continent. It is real, and it is also still being refined, and an honest account says both things at once. What that wider record reveals, though, is where this story stops being about the Comanche alone. Because the maternal and paternal lines of every Native American people, the Comanche included, do not simply end in the Great Basin or on the southern plains. They carry the same deep signatures, the same ancient markers found from the Arctic to the tip of South America. The desert was only a recent address. The Plains Empire was newer still. To find where Comanche ancestry truly bottoms out, where the line finally runs cold, you cannot stop in Nevada and you cannot stop in Texas. You have to go back more than 12,000 years to the very first human beings who ever set foot in the Americas. The story of the first Americans begins not in America at all, but in the cold of Ice Age Siberia. The consensus that genetics has built over the last 2 decades points to a single founding population, a group that moved out of Asia and into a now vanished land called Beringia, the broad bridge of territory that once joined Siberia to Alaska when the seas were low. And there, the evidence suggests, they stopped. For thousands of years, this founding population sat isolated in the Beringian region, cut off from the peoples of Asia behind them and the empty continent ahead, somewhere in the long window between roughly 25,000 and 15,000 years ago. Geneticists call it the Beringian standstill. In that isolation, they changed. Mutations accumulated, and the result was a distinct genetic signature carried by their descendants ever since. The maternal lineages labeled A, B, C, D, and X, and the paternal line labeled Q, markers found today in indigenous peoples from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America, and carried by the Comanche, along with everyone else. Then the ice opened, and they came down into the continent, and they spread with breathtaking speed. We have a face for that first wave. In 1968, on a ranch near the small town of Wilsall in western Montana, workers uncovered the burial of an infant boy, covered in red ochre and laid to rest with around 125 stone and antler tools of the Clovis culture, the oldest widespread tool tradition in North America. He had been in the ground for about 12,600 years. Researchers named him Anzac I, after the family whose land held him. And in 2014, a team led by Morten Rasmussen, Sarah Anzac, and Eska Willerslev sequenced his entire genome. What they found rewrote the family tree of 2 continents. The Anzac child was not an evolutionary dead end. He was directly ancestral to a vast majority of living Native Americans from North America all the way down into South America. Willerslev called it astonishing that one family from one burial in Montana could be ancestral to so many peoples across the Americas, and the deeper roots reached further still. A separate ancient genome, the Malta boy buried near Lake Baikal in Siberia some 24,000 years ago, showed that the first Americans were the product of 2 ancient populations that had met and mingled in Asia before ever crossing into Beringia. The line runs back and back into the deep cold of the last ice age. Now bring it home to the Comanche and feel the full weight of the inversion. Their identity as Lords of the Plains is, at most, 3 or 4 generations deep. Their existence as a separate people is barely older than the United States. But the ancestry running underneath that brand new nation reaches back more than 12,000 years to the first human beings in the Americas, and through Beringia to Ice Age Siberia beyond that. The newest power on the plains was carrying some of the oldest ancestry on the continent. The empire was an instant. The blood was an epic. And that ancient people, freshly and brilliantly remade, was about to collide with something that had never been seen on those plains before. That something was the United States, and the collision came fast. As Mexico opened Texas to foreign settlement in the 1820s and the colonists poured in, the old trade relationships curdled into war over the same hunting grounds. After Texas won its independence in 1836, the raids and reprisals escalated into something merciless. In 1840, Texas officials tried to arrest a Comanche peace delegation in San Antonio, and what became known as the Council House Fight left dozens of Comanche dead, including a dozen chiefs. The retaliation was immense, a great raid sweeping hundreds of warriors all the way to the Gulf Coast. And in one earlier raid, in 1836, the Comanche had taken a 9-year-old settler girl named Cynthia Ann Parker, who grew up among them and bore a son. That son was Quanah Parker, the last principal chief of the Comanche. The end, when it came, was engineered with terrible precision. The treaty signed at Medicine Lodge in 1867 was meant to confine them to a reservation, but many would not go. In 1874, inspired by a medicine man named Isatai, who promised them invulnerability, Quanah led an attack on buffalo hunters at adobe walls, and the long-range rifles behind those walls broke the assault. The Army's revenge was the Red River War, and the decisive blow was not a massacre of people. When Colonel Ranald Mackenzie surprised a Comanche camp in Palo Duro Canyon, he killed almost no one. He killed the horses, more than 1,000 of them, slaughtered in the canyon. The animal that had made the nation was taken from it in an afternoon, and without their herds, they could not survive the winter on the plains. Quanah held out on the high plains for nearly a year, the last free Comanche, before he finally surrendered. The numbers tell the rest. A nation once counted in the tens of thousands had fallen to roughly 1,500 people by 1875. They were settled at Fort Sill, and in 1901 the reservation itself was broken into individual allotments under the Jerome Agreement, the communal land carved up and the surplus thrown open to white settlement. By every calculation of the men who designed it, the Comanche were meant to disappear. They did not. In the Second World War, Comanche code talkers built a battlefield code out of their own language, Numunu words the Germans never broke. In the 1960s, a resurgence of native pride drove them to rebuild their government and their institutions. Today, the Comanche Nation, headquartered at Lawton, Oklahoma, counts around 17,000 enrolled members, and a determined effort is underway to bring the language back from the edge. And this is the truth the legend never told you. The Comanche were never the eternal, unchanging kingdom of the grassland. They were something far more remarkable than that. A desert people who seized one animal and in a handful of generations built an empire that stopped 3 of the most powerful nations on earth, who were nearly erased deliberately by a country that wanted their land, and who refused. That is not the weakness of a people without deep roots. That is the full force of human adaptability, applied against impossible odds, and winning the only victory that ultimately counts: survival. So let go of the picture you started with. The Comanche were never the ancient, unchanging lords of the plains that the legend handed down to us. The DNA and the deep record give a truer story, and a far larger one. A Great Basin desert people who became a continental empire in 3 or 4 generations, riding on top of an ancestry that runs back more than 12,000 years to the first Americans, and across Beringia to Ice Age Asia beyond. The truth is not smaller for the absence of a timeless kingdom. It is bigger for what actually happened, the speed, the reinvention, the sheer refusal to be erased. The name Comanche was given to them by their enemies. The name they kept for themselves was Numunu, the people. And the people are still here. DNA does not give us a simpler story. It gives us a truer one.